Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show... Kevin Annett, welcome back to Windows on the World.
Thanks, Mark.
Hi. There's been a bit of a controversy over the last few days, and it revolves around the ITCCS. And several people have been making claims, quite mindless attacks really, as though people haven't thought it through, which is something I can actually identify with, because it's exactly the same kind of attacks that I had at a certain period when I was at the People's Voice TV and afterwards. Can you just tell us a bit about how you think this controversy came about?
Well, it came about the day I first wrote a letter about the land theft of Aboriginal land by the United Church and the Vatican over 20 years ago. This is really nothing new, Mark. It's what happens about every 2 or 3 years in this work. Concerted, well-funded, very organized, an attempt to make me look like, illegitimate. And, it isn't just the ITCCS that their claim doesn't exist. From the very beginning of my work, any group that I helped organize, the professional misinformers would start circulating rumors that none of that ever existed. It's Kevin's creation. So, it's not a new lie. It's been out there for a long time. I think it's particularly vehement now because we're getting so close to something. We are beginning to not only indict and, convict heads of state in the church for these crimes against humanity, we're showing people that common law court warrants actually have teeth behind them. Just last month in Vancouver, and a lot of these smears are coming out of Vancouver, in Vancouver, we actually intervened and got the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to stand down using our warrants, saying that as agents of the Crown, they were serving a criminal power. And they complied. So it's no accident that once that happens, the powers that be are really quite nervous about this stuff, and they have to discredit it and distract people using all these usual methods that I don't have to go into. People who are involved in any movement are, get at the receiving end of these tactics very quickly. So it's the usual, lies that can't be substantiated. It's like you say, it's not based on any facts. It's just basically gossip and hearsay.
Yes, and that is very true. Every couple of years, there seems to be a kind of major assault, and then they kind of carry on in the background. What I was going to ask you about was really this idea of this Kevin Annett and there's the ITCCS, which is set up. Now, people were attacking you as before the ITCCS, and they were saying that you did not really have the full agreement of the native people, and you'd fallen out with them, and you'd made up names they'd given you. And I knew all this was kind of... There's always this kind of low-level bitching goes on.
Of course. It's like, I don't have the full support of anybody. There's as many natives oppose exposing the genocide as support it. There's as much division within the native world about these issues as there is in the white world. So I've never claimed that I've got all the natives on my side. As a matter of fact, a lot of my critics in the native world tend to be those either getting government money through the tribal councils or friends with the chiefs who are getting government money. So you got to really look at who's saying it and what their motive is in saying this stuff. A lot of the support I get from native people are from the homeless, from the people in really bad shape. They don't have the money to get on the internet and start attacking me or supporting me.
That's a really good point, I think, because there is also an Aboriginal television network that's funded by the government, and this was originally, I think, a few years ago, causing you problems, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, they're an arm of the government. The APTN has got a few natives as window dressing, and its board of directors is entirely white people appointed by the government. They get 100% of their funding from the federal government, so they're an arm of the state. And to give you an example of how they operate, I was invited by 10 Mohawk elders to help conduct a survey on the grounds of the oldest Indian school in Canada, the Mohawk School, set up by the Crown of England in the 1830s. We began to find remains of children's clothing, even some bone fragments in the ground there. There was a first attempt to uncover a mass grave site of children at an Indian school in Canada. You'd think that'd be newsworthy. We were completely blacked out of the Canadian media. APTN, the so-called Aboriginal Peoples TV network, didn't cover any of it. The only time they began to cover what we were doing was when the critics started, and then they came around and they started covering how all these people hate Kevin Annett. So it's very, very contrived.
Yes, I remember that. Was that the Brantford dig?
The Brantford dig, that's right.
Yes, just to remind people, because people have very short memories as far as this stuff goes. They get into the latest episode of mudslinging, but I mean, this is going back a few years as well. And you had quite a few problems there. And just give people a bit of a background of that, of what happened. It's your chance to get that over so that people can't say, oh, and he messed up that dig and he sabotaged it,
No, I mean, the facts are that, again, I was invited and I didn't do this myself. There's footage on itccs.org of the Mohawk elders who actually began the dig, Cheryl and Bill Squire. We found the remains of buttons that were identified as coming from school clothing. There was complete support within the Mohawk world for what we're doing and among the traditional elders, and then it began to get sabotaged.
Well, that sounds a very familiar story, because that also brings us on to a link that I wanted to make with some other people who are criticising you about getting these bones out at this Occupy rally to get maximum attention. Well, I couldn't really see anything wrong with that. Can you tell me why that would be wrong? Did it upset any native people that these bones had been exhibited, these bone fragments, these tiny bone fragments?
Well, it seemed really odd to me, Mark. People were not upset about the fact that children were murdered and thrown in the ground. They're upset about that I'm talking about it. Now, people better examine their values when they get upset about exposure rather than the crime itself. But just to clarify that, when I was invited by the Mohawk elders, the first thing I said is, do you guys want this exposed publicly? And they said, absolutely. We want the world to know what happened. So after we excavated those bones, and they were positively identified as coming from a young child, as a matter of fact, Chris Nargang, the archaeologist, said, I'm 90% sure this is a child's knee socket bone. I said, can I show this to the world, to the media? They said, yes, please go for it. So I was mandated by the elders to do that. I wasn't acting on my own or anything. It was then subsequently confirmed by a guy at the Smithsonian Institute, a Dr. Don Ortner, that it was in fact a human bone. He agreed to come up and help on the site. Then he dies of a heart attack 2 months later. I mean, we're up against powerful forces here.
I do remember that episode, and it almost is. You get to this point, because this has happened with me when I was at the People's Voice, previous to that and afterwards. And you get to a point where you think, well, I can't really do wrong. I can't do right for doing wrong. You get criticised for something if you do it, and you get criticised if you don't do it. So yeah, a lot of this stuff I've been able to identify and look at, but I think it's good to go into some of these details. Now, what I noticed was that nobody picked up at that Occupy rally was it was run entirely on consensus and what they call the human mic. So when you were saying something, they're all repeating it. So for instance, it was something along the lines of, all the children need a proper burial, and they'd all repeat, all the children need a proper burial. And this is really how Occupy was taken over, yet nobody seemed to actually go out and say anything about the facilitator-led agenda, which brought in Agenda 21 to Occupy, which brought in trained change agents and undercover police to occupy St. Paul's, and we exposed that in a film called The Puppet Masters of Occupy. That people were trained to go in and take over the movement by consensus, which means you have these childlike meetings where people spout this nonsense, these childish mantras. and they're not questioning why they do it. Now, that is something that really does amaze me, that okay, so you got these bone fragments out, but nobody questioned this childlike stupidity of that meeting, you know.
Well, I experienced that. It was very odd. The Toronto Occupy Toronto rally that I spoke at, it was right at Toronto City Hall. It was kind of ironic because when I was a minister in the downtown part of Toronto, I used to go out at night with food and blankets for the homeless. All of the homeless were Aboriginal people, and they used to sleep right there in front of the City Hall, dying in the snow and the cold. And there I am 15 years later talking right in the same spot about their relatives who were murdered by the Crown, by the churches, in these Indian schools. After I spoke, there was a chance for questions. Nobody said a word. Nobody came up to offer help. Nobody said, we got to do something about this mass murder. And the only comment I got from a young guy was, hey, man, they really messed with my mind. Well, excuse me, I'm sorry to upset you, but this is, this is the mentality you're dealing with. And as long as it's like that, I mean, they're going to continue to get away with these killings, these child killings.
It's very exasperating, Kevin, because we made a film called The Puppet Masters of Occupy, which pointed out exactly how it had been taken over at St. Paul's, who took it over, and who funded the takeover, and where the money was going. The money was being siphoned off. People like Vivienne Westwood were giving vast amounts of money to Occupy, which was, in my opinion, a complete waste of time, because all that money was then subverted and diverted into this Agenda 21, which it all became. And all of those people who set up that Occupy and ruined it, set up this new phase of the Occupy, obviously to get to shut it down, the divide and rule. There's so much information in that video. The Puppet Masters of Occupy shows you exactly how they do it. It's a subversive Marxist agenda, and people fall for it time and time again. So that's what they should be questioning, in my opinion. The way that protest is shut down, and people are treated like children. And I've saw this. When I was at Occupy, we exposed the whole thing. We did 3 films on Occupy, one on the Bank of Ideas, which was a fake squat set up to change the squatting laws for the worse, with bailiffs running over pedestrians and fake protesters brought in that look as though they're off a film set, undercover police who we've seen time and time again in different roles, with different earrings on, with different boots, with a different military jacket on. But all of these things that are still going on, like the People's Assembly, and they turn up time and time and time again. And the few people do call them out, but the vast majority of the public will still go along with it. So to me, this splitting hairs over showing a bone fragment, yes, it is absolutely childish and ridiculous in my opinion. Now, what people were saying was that it's somehow you'd trampled on the dignity of the elders, Now, is that a valid point at all?
I don't know what elders they're talking about. The only elder who seemed upset, and this is a funny term, elders.
Yes.
There's so much warfare in the native world between everyone claiming to be a traditional elder. I'm the elder and you're not. I mean, there's no more divided community than the Aboriginal world. But of the 10 traditional leaders in that community who invited me in, only one of them broke and started criticizing me, a guy called Frank Miller. He is the one who created this video that they're quoting. They put up a thing on YouTube where Frank, on his own, says, Kevin doesn't represent us. He's working against and insulting the elders without any proof. And so everyone grabs onto that and says, there's proof, right? The reality is that I'm not the issue. He's not the issue. Those children in the ground are the issue. And everyone instinctively turns away from them and doesn't want to talk about them. So, I mean, that's really what's going on.
Well, that's what I found very interesting about what you were doing in the first place. Because when I first met you, I thought, nobody's going this far. And when we did that first interview, I posted that up on the show that we did previously, which is getting quite a lot of hits now because of this latest controversy, because it really is the core of what it's about. And even if people have a problem with you personally or on any other level, the information that you gave in those 10 minutes is valid.
Right. People, if you have a difference, talk to me. You know, I said this to Alfred Weber many times. Look, I know you have concerns about things that people have been putting in your ear about me. Talk to me first. Let's work it out. Instead of talking about it, next thing I know, he's on the internet denouncing me publicly. I mean, this is how children act. You know, it's not how mature, caring people act.
No, but it's very interesting, actually, that I think Mr. Weber, if I'm correct here, described you as a globalist operative. Well, if you look at his Wikipedia CV, if it's true, then he is a globalist operative.
He's from Yale University. I don't know. I'm not going to counterattack Alfred. That's not the point. I don't really know what he is. I know he's a really disturbed individual. I've known him for over 10 years, and he's got major problems. But, you know, just on a personal level. But I'm not kind of harping on that. That's really not the question. The point is, and the question I have for him, is why did he change his mind about me in the space of 3 days? Because on December 9th, he was fine with me. We had a great interview. He was all behind me, promoting the work I'm doing. Suddenly, on I think it was the 12th or the 13th, in a period of about 3 or 4 days, suddenly I'm the big enemy. Now, who spoke to him, and was he threatened? Was he offered money? Exactly why does somebody turn and become a completely different personality in 3 days? And has a totally different attitude on me. That's the question he hasn't asked.
Yes, I don't want to get into any kind of personal attacks. I was just kind of giving an example there that it doesn't seem a fair or right form of attack to say that about you when people could say it about him. You know, I mean, so this does seem a bit ridiculous, and this is how they escalate things. You know,
right? So we're not taking the bait. I'm not going to attack him. I'm sticking to the issue, and anyone who's serious has to stay focused on the issue and not. You know, I had a basic policy from the start of this work 20 years ago. I'll never take money from the government or the church or the state, the corporations or anyone responsible for these crimes. We're funded by the community. And the second policy is we don't attack each other personally and in public. That's what they want us to do. Anyone who starts using those tactics is either stupid or working for the other side.
That's exactly my point. And this is what I've found. The people who do it are thinking on a very petty-minded level, or they're being paid to do it. And there's actually no difference in the result, because I know for a fact that there were people paid to interfere with what I was doing. And I'm not saying that because I think I'm in any way important. I'm just a person putting out information. But I know for a fact that there were people put in to disrupt, and I know the techniques they use, and I've named and shamed them and proved that there are websites set up by so-called ex-police who now work very closely with private security. And I think this is the important thing, that we're not talking about some big state conspiracy here. We're talking about private interests who are being employed to watch, surveil and interfere with what citizen journalists are doing.
Well, it's interesting what you said, too, about a lot of the disruption on your side was coming out of Italy. We know that we found the same experience. A lot of the internet attacks are coming from Italy. We know that one of the major sources of this is what's called the Holy Alliance. It's the Jesuit-sponsored Vatican Counterintelligence Service and Assassination Bureau. They were, in fact, the ones responsible for killing Pope John Paul I in 1978 when he began to look into the Vatican Bank connection with the mob. They're responsible for a lot of this subversion, and they work closely with 'Ndrangheta, the mafia criminal syndicate. Now, we exposed that the last couple of months. That's one of the reasons we're getting so heavily attacked by a well-funded campaign. It's coming from the 'Ndrangheta and the Jesuit spy agency, definitely.
I don't know whether that's encouraging to know or not, Kevin, really. I prefer to think it was some sad person sat in an internet cafe trying to hack into my website.
It wouldn't be this big and this consistent. I mean, all of the people who are going after me, most of them didn't know one another. Suddenly, there they all are sitting in the same TV studio together, talking about me. Now, who paid them to come together? Who contacted them? It takes a lot of work to do that. I mean, obviously, there's bigger forces involved in this stuff.
Yes, and that really ties in with what we found. There's an article on windowsontheworld.net called Police State Harassment Exposed, which I renamed, mark my words, Police State Harassment Exposed, as somebody who was allegedly an ex-police employee wrote a rather strange and pointless article about me that didn't really say anything, but it kind of what they try and infer is that you're some kind of paranoid conspiracy theorist, or you're working for the other side. Now, their main thing was like, who does he really work for? Well, to answer my critics, I've been self-employed for 25 years. So, it does get ridiculous. But your point there was very interesting, because you said, who pays these people to come together? Now, this is exactly what I found was happening. That a group of people are all aligned, they all know each other, and they're all working together. They all back each other up in public interviews and public forums, and behind them they have like a little army of internet warriors who are constantly posting nonsense. So yeah, it seems to work pretty similarly, but we did do quite a lot of stuff on that. We did a show called Infiltration Special, which covered everything from Delphi technique, with how Occupy was taken over, to how local council meetings are taken over. And you must have come across this an awful lot, because when you're trying to get your point over, there's already an agenda set and you can't do it.
Oh, it's remarkable how that you see, they're all reading from the same script. And the first time I held a public tribunal into the crimes and the murders in the Indian schools in Canada. It was in Vancouver in June 1998. Exactly the same attacks that came after that tribunal, or what we're hearing these days. I mean, just all those years later, and it doesn't really change, but people's memory is so short, they don't realize that it's really the same people saying the same stuff. They just wait a year and start saying it again.
It's very true, because there was a Glenn Greenwald document released. It was Joint Threat Risk Intelligence, and it was like a slideshow for people who were meant to be recruited by British intelligence services, and it looks very authentic to me. We used those slides, but if you look at them, the 4 Ds, deny, disrupt, degrade and deceive, they work to a handbook, and because they work in a hierarchical organisation, they cannot deviate from those tactics. They have to use the same tactics. So what I found was extremely useful was humour.
Yeah,
and calling them out as though they were dumb cops. Yeah. Because they can't respond to that. It's like an undercover cop. Once you blow his cover, he's out of the building. And it's very much the same with these people. But let's get back to what this is really about. And before we move on to what you're going to be doing in the future, there's this allegation that George Dufort is an alias, or it could be you. Do you just want to answer that one?
Yeah, it is an alias. It's not me. Just a little side note. I want to thank everybody for crediting me with such superhuman powers to single-handedly have got one pope and 3 cardinals to step down. Thank you. But no, it isn't just me. There's ITCCS groups all over the world operating. I can even name names of people in each country. But in terms of George Dufort, it's a pseudonym of a Belgian lawyer who helped us set up the ITCCS in 2010. And he has had to maintain anonymity for his own safety. Laurent Louis, the member of parliament in Belgium, who now is facing jail after having been stripped of his parliamentary immunity for naming child rapists in the Dutch and Belgian royal families. That shows you what happens if you don't, surround yourself with some kind of anonymity in this work when you're in a sensitive position. So yeah, it's a pseudonym, of course, but it's just like with the judges in the common law court cases, we're not going to expose the public faces of these people because look at who we're up against. I mean, that'd be insanity.
Well, it would, definitely. So there was this other allegation that this person said that his name had been put down on a jury that he wasn't on. Do you just want to answer that?
I think you might be referring to Alex Hunter. He was asked, he's a guy in Vancouver who was active with our group there for about a year, and then he dropped out quickly without explanation. He said he wanted to be on the jury, and then he just vanished. So I don't know what he's talking about. The point is, people who get involved in the ITCCS, we checked them out. And this guy was pretty shady. And no, it didn't go very far because he apparently had been going into other groups and being quite disruptive. And so I'm glad he dropped out of the ITCCS group. I haven't heard from him until suddenly he appears in Alfred's video. So the whole thing is very suspect.
Okay. There's also the name of this person, Jeremiah Jourdain. That kept coming up even before this current controversy. Do you just want to address that one before we move on?
Yeah, I hope it's the last one. Jeremiah was a Métis fellow in Manitoba. He died last year. He was a friend of Louis Daniels, who was one of our original founders. Louis was one of the 6 people who was killed. He died quickly in a hospital. He was kind of the liaison between the Ojibwe Nation and the ITCCS. He gets killed in the hospital, like people like William Coombs. This is all going to be the subject of the grand jury that's convening in Vancouver next month. We're looking into how these ITCCS members were killed. Jeremiah Jourdain dropped out of sight after Louis died. He gave his name to various things, but no, he died last year. I'm not even quite sure how he died. But they just grab these names out of the hat and just make these random allegations that have no kind of bearing in fact.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's a very similar tactic to what we've experienced. So, again, a lot of this stuff is out of a handbook. Now, the big thing they always go for, and they did this with me, I don't know why, they asked me where all the money had gone at the People's Voice, but they seem to blame me for it, as they do. So, okay, Kevin, where's all the money gone?
All the money from all the homeless Indians I work with? Gee, I don't know. Yeah, I hear that I jet set around the world living off hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm curious where the money's coming from too, because I couch surf. I haven't even been able to afford to go back to Europe when I've been invited twice because I don't have the money. So this is just nonsensical claims. I've been blacklisted, no taxable income, no source of regular income for almost 20 years, living on family and what the community provides. So, I mean, when they're going to cook up a lie, they should cook up one that's provable, because this is just nonsense.
Yeah, but it's a typical tactic, isn't it? It always gets brought up about money. And of course, when you...
Financial stuff, sexual stuff, and mental instability. Those are the 3 they go after.
Oh, I've had all that thrown at me. Those are the standard things that they use. But really, what it's about is the information. And the people who are mudslinging and criticising from the sidelines aren't putting out information. Now, I find in the so-called truth movement, it's no different from any other part of daily life. You're going to get people who are the equivalent of the people who love to gossip, are petty-minded. They're the equivalent of the people who'll stay in on Saturday night, watch nothing but the X Factor and I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here, and talk about it the next day as though it's real. And that's the problem, I think, that there's this huge amount of people who are missing the point, because as these banks, the corporations, which are countries, are looting every single asset of their own citizens and marching towards absolute martial law and mass population reduction, they're arguing about where your donations have gone. I mean, quite frankly, I find that absolutely pathetic.
Well, I should say that we do get donations fairly regularly. They've increased, even in the wake of all these smears. I think it's a vote of confidence, actually. There's a PayPal button at itccs.org. And the donations go primarily towards travel for myself and a couple of other people who are, like in North America, who are doing a lot of the research on the ground. It goes into research and travel costs.
Yes, and I think this is the problem people don't get, is that when you're running a small organisation of a couple of people who are helping out and you're all doing it all yourselves and you've got a donate button on your website, you're not getting masses of money in. This is an actual fact. It just doesn't happen. I know a lot of people who try and rely on donations and just can't do it.
Well, these attacks are all irrational. They're not meant to make any sense. They're meant to, they're constructed by psychological profilers who look at the activists and they know exactly where people's worst fears are. In the general population, there's that fear of being taken advantage of, being lied to, being betrayed. And so they start planting doubts. They don't come out with anything you can hang on. Just they say, well, you don't quite know everything about Mark, you know. I would be careful about him. They plant doubt and suspicion. And that's really all you need to do with about 90% of people. But anyone with a brain and critical judgment can look at this stuff and none of it makes any sense.
Well, that's exactly right. It doesn't. And I've had real hatred written about me, but it's all nonsense. It all revolves around who does he really work for? You know, well, if that's the best they can do, you know, it's these people. They need to recruit some people who are probably more effective, because they do use these same techniques over and over again.
Well, gossip is more it's funny about people because gossip is a much more fun thing to do than look at hard facts. It's much better to spin a web of fantasy that confirms our own prejudices rather than look at things as they are and say, my God, there's this crime happening in our own backyard. We better do something about it. It's better to attack one another. It's easier to attack one another than people with the power who might hurt you. So I get where people are coming from, but we have to just move beyond this stuff.
The unfortunate thing is that there's many people who never learn from it. They're still waiting for their next episode of EastEnders, you know, or whatever it is. And that's really, sadly, all it's about. It's about a hyena mentality that when someone's down, everyone join in and kick them. Really, that's all it is. And the information gets lost. And this is the thing that I always try and put out information. That's why I don't want to get too much into this kind of thing. So we'll move on in a minute. But there's just a couple of other things that probably would be best cleared up, especially this allegation that because you convened these courts in Brussels, you were under canon law and couldn't possibly be under common law, which really doesn't make any sense to me, because if you're convening the court and you're using common law, well, what difference does it make what country you do it in?
Well, exactly. I mean, anyway, they're totally mistaken. They don't understand what canon law is to make such an asinine remark. Canon law is simply statute created by the Church of Rome for its own corporation. They're internal statutes, and they have nothing to do with other countries. It's like pretending that the Pope is a head of a state. He isn't. He's the head of a corporation. He has the Vatican is not a state, regardless of the words they use. Under international law, it is not a state, but they pretend it is. It's like this. It's the words they throw around have no substance in reality. Common law is the law of nature. It applies everywhere.
Well, it's natural law, which usurps everything. But the whole point is that this system of merchant law came out of the Crown. It came out of London. It came out of the Westminster Statutes. So the fact is that you can say the same about Britain, because Britain, as we've discussed before, was totally under the power of the Holy See. So that argument is totally irrelevant, and I think the person who said it mentioned Bill Thornton. Now, Bill Thornton clearly states that you make the court your court. I don't know whether this applies to what you were doing in this respect, though, because this is one point I can see that people would have a problem with, in that the convening of these courts and it being done on the internet without any proper official record. I can see people having a go at that, but to me, but to me, that wasn't an issue in the respect of that you're bringing this thing into the public domain, which is, I think, is all you can do.
That's right, Mark. But just to clarify, it did occur in a public space. There is a bona fide court record. It did convene physically. It wasn't an internet creation. It was reported on the internet. We didn't have TV cameras covering it as a public court. It was a closed session. You can have closed sessions of a court. Things can be held in camera. People don't seem to put two and two together and realize that, yes, if it was publicized, those jurors would probably be dead by now or in hiding. So, I mean, the only reason we've had the success we've had in forcing these resignations and exposing these crimes is because it's been anonymous.
Yes. And, of course, any record kept by a member of the public is a court of public record and can be used as a court of public record. And any member of the public can put an affidavit together and it can become the highest form of truth unless rebutted. So, in actual fact, the original premise of what you were doing was, in my view, correct in that you were putting things into the form of an affidavit and they weren't rebutting them. Am I understanding this properly?
That's right. You're accusing one of the heads of a state of kidnapping and killing children. You accuse him of that publicly. You have an eyewitness, you have evidence, and they don't answer. That's how King Charles I had his head chopped off. He would not plea, and so the High Court of Parliament said, you have admitted to your guilt, off with his head. Now that's the precedent in English law, which created the Republic in 1649. You know, I mean, that's enough of a precedent for us. We told Elizabeth Windsor, you are accused of these crimes. How do you plead? No answer. That's an admission of guilt under the law.
Well, yeah, the allegation that was thrown at you, I think, in one of these interviews was that how could they possibly know about it, and were they ever served with any documentation prior to this trial?
Pinned on the door of Buckingham Palace and filmed, faxed to the Queen, and also when you display something in public over the YouTube, and courts have already ruled on this, as soon as you go on YouTube and say to somebody, hey, I'm serving you, that's being served. Okay, it's not even substitute service, it's actual service under the rules of evidence in court. So, you know, I don't even know what people are talking about. This is just nonsense.
Yes, I was picking that up because I do remember that you had gone through this issue of service and that everybody had been served correctly. So that's kind of cleared that up now, and we don't really want to waste too much time on it. I just wanted to go into the case of David Compan for a while, because we covered that on the show, and it was really only because of diligent members of the public, which is what everyone should be doing, really, is backing people up when they're getting into trouble rather than bitching amongst themselves, because I think he could have got into a lot of trouble if it wasn't for the publicity around that case.
Absolutely. And then David was one case, and Vivian Cunningham, the soldier after, who faced the same thing, incarceration in a mental hospital simply for telling his captain that there was the Queen had been found guilty in a court of child trafficking. You know, so that's an example. When people began to besiege the hospital with phone calls and threaten picketing the place, they released him. And that shows you that public exposure does work.
They've got a warrant to search for and remove you from your place of residence. And have they also arrested your wife? Is that right?
That's right, they did it.
We have in the studio David Compan, NHS electrician just released after being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. If you weren't with anybody, you'd have just disappeared. Nobody would know where you are, and you can be detained indefinitely.
That's right. Thank you very much for all your support. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Well, yes, those cases were quite different in a way, because David was a civilian and the other guy was basically working as an officer of the Crown. He was a soldier and he'd signed up to that. He was contracted to the Crown. So really, theoretically, they could have done with him whatever they wanted, because obviously they have their own martial law courts. So they were both very interesting cases, and we did a very interesting analysis of what happened with David Compan. But really, this is taking things where they should be into the bigger picture. Why are citizens being forcibly injected and taken against their will by the police to places of incarceration where, if they did not have close relatives or access to any kind of media outlets, which David did through the ITCCS, they could probably still be there or worse. And that is what should be concerning people.
Exactly. And, you know, in all of this so-called controversy, the question is, what is people's intent? You can tell what a person's intent is by their action. Now, if we're focused every day on freeing children and freeing people from prison, obviously that's, you know, our intent is to do that. If somebody spends their whole day attacking me, well, they're not concerned about anything but that petty agenda. So we go on how people prove and practice what they're doing. People are getting locked up now because, you know, the whole mask is slipped, and the de facto, you know, governments in courts have been exposed to having no lawful authority. And I think that they're coming down on people with a hammer because of that.
That's exactly right. And what we've found, there is an abuse of due process even within their own system, which is now basically just run like a mafia. The courts are run like a mafia. The mafia is the judiciary working with private interests such as the police, who are now private so-called bailiff companies who are not appointed by a court, who have interests in the private companies they are working for whilst working as officers of the Crown. Now, that is what should be worrying people.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that's great. We've cleared all that up now, and to focus on the really important stuff. Exactly what is the intent? Now, when you started doing this, I don't know anybody previous there was apparently quite a few people exposing this Canadian genocide. It's been alleged that you copied them or something. Well, what a ridiculous thing to say, because I see an injustice. Someone brings an injustice to me. I put the injustice out there into the public domain, and they accuse me of not being the first one to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to answer that whole nonsense. We can swat at flies all night, but I mean, the reality is that 30 people were actually named in the indictment in our first court case. People can look at the evidence all online. And again, here it disproves any claim that there isn't evidence. 150 exhibits that we used to show that the Crown, the Vatican, the government and churches of Canada were planning genocide and now are covering it up. That's at itccs.org. It's the first case of the common law court. And there were 30 people served summonses, including the Prime Minister of Canada, the heads of these churches. None of them ever replied. They all admitted by their silence that they were guilty. And, there's eyewitness testimonies, there's government documents showing. And here's a really interesting document I came up with. I found that in the very first year the residential schools opened in Western Canada in 1889, the death rate was already over 40% that first year. Now, the whole claim of the government and the churches is, well, these diseases gradually, accumulated, and it was unfortunate. If it was a gradual process, why would the kids be dying at that rate the very first year the school opened, when the death rate was about 2% on their Indian reservation? They were killing factories. They were brought in to spread disease and kill off the kids. That document proved, gave a lot of credence to that whole thing. Again, nobody's ever commented on this because they don't want to, because it's proving their guilt.
That's right, and I would recommend to anybody who's got into this recently and has seen all this mudslinging and nonsense going on to watch Unrepentant and make up their own mind.
Yeah, that's up at, again, you can see that itccs.org, and all of my original book, Hidden No Longer, Genocide in Canada, that's at hiddennolonger.com.
That's great, Kevin, because in the forthcoming weeks, I'd like to get more into the history and background of this Roman cult, this Vatican cult, so people can get a historical handle on it. So I'd like to talk to you more about that. But in the meantime, just for the sake of rounding up today's interview, so what is your next move? What's the next move for Kevin Annett and the ITCCS?
Well, both in Canada and internationally, there's a lot of really important developments. We're right on the verge of some big openings, which is probably why all these attacks are escalating so much right now. In Canada, on January 15th, there's a convention that is going to convene the Republic, going to officially sever ties with the Crown of England, declare Canada a republic, establish a constitution and a High Court of Justice, which will give constitutional authority to the common law courts that are operating in Canada. They're going to cancel all debts. All Crown courts will then be invalid. All Crown agents like police, RCMP, members of Parliament, they won't have any standing authority anymore. So it's really an amazing opportunity for people to take back their own country. And that's also on a bigger scale. We're finding that the common law courts are taking off everywhere. Like, for example, Australia, Leith and Cameron, the two organizers there, have found an incredible response from the Aboriginal people and the Maoris in New Zealand, who are using the common law model to establish their own independence. So this is really beginning to develop. There's the Dutch People's Tribunal that's looking at the whole transhumanist agenda. They're working with us there. And, eyewitnesses to these child killings in Holland and Belgium, they're going to be part of that court. So things are really opening up. And again, people should just follow these developments at itccs.org. And if you want to write and get involved, the email of the head office is itccsoffice@gmail.com.
Yes, Kevin, the most important thing about this is knowledge is power. Without the knowledge of how this system works, how it's enslaved us, and how it's going to take everything that people think they own, then they need to get involved, because we don't really have much time. This UN agenda, and Agenda 21, is being implemented at local level, and the police are now a private army. They're acting as a private army. The courts are acting merely as administration, and they have done since the mid-1800s. But now they're usurping their own rules of law. Basically, we've got a mafia we're dealing with, so it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Vatican, the UN, or any other corporation. They're all acting outside the law, and they're coming for everything you've got. So let's stay on track and empower ourselves with knowledge, and basically stop the infighting and the nonsense, and bringing things down to the level of a soap opera. So thanks a lot, Kevin, and we'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you, Mark. You sure will.
Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.